We can all agree that Jeffrey Dahmer was a monster, to say the least. What he did to those people was very ruthless. However, of all of the serial killers who were there before him, some have done way worse than he has. You may have heard of some of them, but you will find out about others today. Today, we look at 10 people who were worse than Jeffrey Dahmer. Harold Shipman. Also known as Dr. Death, Harold Shipman is said to have killed at least 218 patients. However, it is speculated that his total number of murders is closer to 250. Shipman was a doctor by profession who practiced in London. He worked in 2 different offices between the years of 1972 and 1998, and all this time, he was still killing people. However, his luck ran out when several people raised a red flag. The main person who became suspicious of the doctor was an undertaker who was surprised by the sheer number of cremation certificates that Shipman was listed on. It was this and the fact that most of the cases were elderly women who had died in bed, not at night, but rather during the day. When the police were told about this, they mishandled the investigation and Shipman kept on killing. However, once he became greedy and tried to concoct a will for a victim that named him as a beneficiary, the victim's daughter eventually became suspicious, leading to an investigation that led to his conviction in 2000. Shipman then took his own life in prison in 2004. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was a construction worker who was known by his suburban neighbors as outgoing. He was also involved in politics and even acted as a clown for birthday parties. However, he was not really a clown. Gacy was first suspected in 1978 when a 15-year-old boy who was last seen with him disappeared. But that was not the only time the family of missing boys pointed fingers at Gacy. However, it was the first time that authorities took it seriously. Soon after, the police were able to get a search warrant, giving them access to Gacy's home. Upon entering, they were met by the smell of nearly 30 bodies that were all buried in a 4-foot crawl space under his home. He was convicted of 33 counts of murder with some additional counts of rape and torture. He was later executed by lethal injection in 1994. Jack the Ripper. We call him Jack the Ripper because nobody really knows who the man behind one of the oldest and most notorious murder sprees was. The killer first appeared in London's Whitechapel district in 1888 and went on to murder 5 women who were all prostitutes. In addition to that, he went on to mutilate their corpses. The police at the time speculated that the killer was probably a surgeon, butcher, or someone who was skilled with a scalpel. The killer then mocked the police by sending letters that had an outline of the axe. Even though many suspects have been named over the years, the killer has never really been identified. H. Holmes. Even though Chicago has had its fair share of killers, none of them were as haunting as H. Holmes. This was a pharmacist who turned a hotel into a torture castle. Approaching the 1893 World's Fair, Holmes moved to Chicago and started adding all sorts of nefarious contraptions to a 3-story hotel. We are talking about gas lines, secret passages, and trapdoors, hallways that lead to dead ends, chutes to the basement, soundproof padding, and torture devices strewn throughout the maze. The gas would allow him to knock out his guests before the worst of what would happen next. Most of this was done on his surgical tables. He would then go on to burn the bodies in the building's furnace, selling the skeletons to medical schools and running life insurance scams. All his murders accumulated to more than 30 murders, which was only discovered after a fellow scammer turned him in for falling short of a financial agreement. He was then hanged in 1896. Pedro Lopez. There is a chance that one of the world's most prolific serial killers might still be on the loose. It is speculated that Pedro Lopez is responsible for more than 300 murders in his native Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Of all those murdered, 1/3 of them are said to be tribal women. After Lopez was arrested in 1980, police ran an investigation and found more than 50 of his preteen victims. He was then convicted of murdering 110 girls in Ecuador and confessed to 240 more murders in Colombia and Peru. By this time, he was already nicknamed the Monster of the Andes. Having spent less than 20 years in prison, he was released in 1988 for good behavior. 20 years later, nobody knows of his whereabouts. Ed Gein. The man who inspired Psycho, The Silence of the Lambs, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre grew up in an isolated area of Wisconsin. When he was a child, he was constantly abused by his alcoholic father. At the same time, his puritanical and domineering mother instilled in him a pathological fear of both women and sex. Later on, in a span of 5 years, he had already lost his entire family, leaving him alone at the family farm. He eventually turned a few rooms in the house into a shrine of sorts, dedicating it to his mother. 13 years later, the local police were following up on a missing hardware store owner, Bernice Warden. This investigation led them to the farm, where they discovered Warden's headless corpse hanging upside down from the rafters. They ended up searching the entire property, and this is where they found the Hall of Horrors. Human body parts had been turned into household items such as chairs and bowls. Faces were used as wall hangings, and a vest was made up of a human torso. Most of these items were from dead bodies Gein had dug up from the graves. However, he had only murdered one other woman apart from Warden. When he was asked about it, he claimed that he was assembling a new version of his beloved mother from the body parts. He was later diagnosed with schizophrenia and declared unfit for trial. A decade later, he was convicted of one of the murders, but since he was declared insane at the time of the crime, he spent his entire life in a mental hospital. Belle Gunness. Nicknamed Lady Bluebeard, Gunness immigrated to America from Norway in 1881, where she married a fellow Norwegian immigrant and settled in Chicago. The couple then went on to have 4 children, 2 of whom died young. They had a candy store that mysteriously burned down in 1900, and her husband died. Even though both were under suspicious circumstances, Gunness was able to collect multiple insurance policy payouts that allowed her to buy a farm in LaPorte, Indiana. About 8 months after remarrying, her second husband died. According to Gunness, he had received a fatal burn from scalding water and had been hit on the head by a heavy meat grinder. After investigation, there was no proof of foul play, and so an inquest was held, which eventually led to her receiving another hefty insurance payout. Shortly after, she was already placing newspaper advertisements in search of a third husband. However, in her adverts, the requirement was that the potential suitors visit her Indiana farm. Several prospects made it there, but never returned from the farm. Only one of them ever made it out alive, and it was after he woke up to see a sinister-looking Gunness standing over him. There are no records of how many people Gunness murdered, but it seems that she herself met a grisly end. Her farm was devastated by a fire, and in the wreckage were the bodies of her remaining children and a decapitated corpse of a woman. However, this body was not the same as the heavy-set Belle's. Belle's true fate remains unknown, but there have been a number of unverified sightings over the decades. Andrei Chikatilo. Between 1978 and 1990, a Russian serial killer sexually assaulted, murdered, and mutilated more than 50 young women and children. Chikatilo would kill his victims by stabbing, then slashing them with a knife. Of all his victims, the youngest was 9 years old. After he was arrested, he admitted he was only able to achieve orgasm by stabbing women, which is a fact that made it difficult for him to resist his strong urges to kill. He had already been nicknamed the Butcher of Rostov, and even though he confessed to a total of 56 brutal murders, he was only tried for 53, sentenced to death, and executed by firing squad in 1994. Joachim Kroll. Joachim Kroll was a German serial killer who was responsible for taking the lives of about 14 people, including young children. This was between 1955 and 1976. After he strangled his victims with his bare hands, he would go on to have sex with their corpses before cutting them up into pieces to eat. Kroll was arrested because a neighbor complained about a backup in the plumbing, clogged with human remains. When Kroll was finally arrested, he was in the process of simmering body parts that he had gotten from his most recent victim, 4-year-old Marion Ketter. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy loved the attention his murders gave him, and most of the world would give him even more. He mostly operated in the western U.S. with an unknown number of murders under his belt. Most of his victims were college-age women, all the way from Washington and Oregon to Utah and Colorado. He was once arrested in Colorado and convicted of kidnapping, but he was able to escape custody. He then moved to Florida, where he continued killing. When Bundy was finally arrested, unlike other criminals, the accused murderer decided to act as his own lawyer. It is believed that this was the very first televised murder trial. He eventually lost the case and was executed in an electric chair in 1989. Do you know other killers who are worse than Dahmer? Feel free to share it in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.